Christian parenting.
Welcome to the Called to Love podcast, where we discuss all things adoption and foster care and dive into the practical, the clinical, and most importantly, the biblical perspectives to help you and your family thrive. I'm Summer Colbert, adopted mom, director of adoption and foster ministry, and champion for the Arkansas Baptist Children and Family Ministries. Adoption and foster care aren't just a process. They are both unique invitations to go on a journey with the Lord, where you will experience life-changing opportunities to grow in your faith and learn to love in an entirely new way. One thing is for sure, being called to love means you will never be the same.
Hi, I'm Zoe, producer of the Called to Love podcast. As the year comes to an end, it is a great opportunity to reflect on everything God has done, and He has done great things for this podcast. Summer and I thank you so much for listening and joining us every week, and we thought this would be a great opportunity to hear the best moments from Called to Love. Kicking things off, the number one most downloaded episode so far, with currently over 800 downloads, is Summer's very first episode, released in September 2023. It's called Reframing Your Mindset as a Christian Adoptive Parent, Reflect on Your Calling. Here's a moment from that episode.
There's a picture on my desk that is warped and bent. And it's a picture of me when I was 20 years old and on my first ever overseas mission trip. And I purposely sat it in front of me today just as an inspiration and reminder in beginning our journey together. And I'm looking at this 20-year-old girl who has no clue what she was about to embark on or how God was going to use the events, even of that week. In this picture, I'm surrounded by 10 beautiful smiling faces in school uniforms, and one little girl in particular has her arm wrapped tight around me. And without realizing it, God used that little girl over the course of a week's mission trip to plant a seed in my heart that has affected the course of my life in a way that I could have never imagined. And it's honestly what God used to have me in this moment talking with you today. So I want to share a little bit of that story with you as we get started. Over spring break in 2003, dating myself a little bit, I was in college and I went with a group from my church on a mission trip to Belize in Central America, where we worked all week to build a new school for a local village called San Ignacio along the Belmopan River. And it was my first time overseas, like I said, and my first time really experiencing the realities of poverty and a lost world in desperate need of Jesus outside of my little bubble. And while all the guys did the manual labor in the jungle heat and humidity, which was brutal, I got the fun job of, I remember driving a stick shift geo tracker because I was the only girl on the team who knew how to drive a stick shift. Thanks, Dad. And I went into the village each day for groceries and supplies to feed everybody as they came in from a hard day's work. And then we got to go visit the school children that we were serving and building that building for. And it was such a special time. And I remember on the first day of our trip, I was greeted by a very eager, a very curious, and a very beautiful face. And she was sweet and bubbly and so excited to have visitors. And though our age difference spanned more than a decade, we became fast friends. And I remember she held my hand as she guided me all around her school, which basically consisted of concrete blocks stacked to form open classrooms with very little light or air circulation. And she showed me her desk with such joy and the board where she would regularly walk up to write answers to math questions. And we would skip through the muddy courtyard and we giggled a lot, despite the fact that a very clear language barrier was present. And that was such a sweet time for me. On our last day, we took one last trip over to the school to say goodbye to the students. And my little friend quickly found me and grabbed my hand to resume our day, just like the ones before. And after only a very short time of play, it was time to say goodbye. There were hugs and several high fives later, and Without really thinking about it, this little girl placed a coin in my hand, and she looked up at me with her beautiful brown eyes, and she smiled in a way that will forever be burned in my memory. And I hugged her one last time, and I forced myself into the van with tears forming, and we began driving down the road. And I sat quietly in this big travel van, admiring the coin in my hand, knowing full well that I would not see my little friend again. And our team leader, who had traveled to this country many times and he understood the people and their culture very well, he asked me if I knew what that little girl had just done. And I just kind of looked at him and I shook my head to let him know that I was clueless, and I was trying to keep from bursting into tears at that point. And he explained to me, he said, "That coin you're holding is that little girl's lunch money for the entire week." Well, I just lost it, because essentially she had given me everything she had. And here I am, this privileged girl from America who never was worried about where my next meal was coming from. And this little girl, out of a blessing and such generosity in her heart, just freely gave that to me. And so I'm just at this point, cue the waterworks, right? I'm bawling, and I started begging our group leader, because we weren't that far away, just to turn around and let me return it to her so that she wouldn't be without lunch money for the week. And he said, no, she gave it as a gift to honor you, and she would not want to take it back because it was her way of showing love. And my heart was just wrecked. And, you think about it, only a short time together with limited words understood between us. And this precious child had given me all that she had. And what looked like a simple coin ended up being a lesson that would affect the course of my life. For years, I held on to that coin as a reminder of the impact that she had made. And right then and there, God planted a seed in my heart that would later prepare me for what He had all along. And just a few days later, my then boyfriend, who was on the trip with us, proposed and became my fiance. And we came back from that mission trip ready to plan an entirely new life together. And that's what we did. We got married in 2004, about a year and a half after this trip. And a few years in, we became parents to our oldest in 2007. And then we were blessed again with our second son 4 years later. And things were relatively easy, right? We were living a quiet life as a young family, and then God decided it was time for a new chapter.
God decided it was time for a new chapter, and that chapter was, of course, adoption, which, of course, led Summer to the path she is on today, working in foster and adoptive ministries and serving you on this podcast. It is not a chapter she expected, but it is exactly where God has called her to be, and you are exactly where God has called you to be. Like with all these episodes, you can go back and listen to the full versions if you missed them, and you can even find them on the Christian Parenting YouTube channel. That was the very first episode of Called to Love. And the second most popular is Lessons Learned in Our Adoption Journey with Summer and Corey from November last year. It's no surprise why this episode would be so popular, hearing from both husband and wife, father and mother, who are on this calling together, working side by side. Here's Summer and Corey.
I think that's a good place for us to start, is maybe what that year of wrestling looked like for us, when one of us would be more motivated and the next one would be like, and then we'd kind of go back and forth and do this tag team all year long.
I think some of this, as your listeners will know, when you have young children in the house, it's hard to think about adding anything else. Mm-hmm. And so I think the struggle is, do we respond to what we feel God calling us to do? Or do we look at the circumstances around us and think that this is too much? Yeah. Or how can God really want this for us right now? Doesn't He see this?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we did. Because we were comfortable. We were nestled into life as young parents, and our boys were healthy and growing and thriving. And it was really a question for me. If I look back now, it was all about disrupting kind of our comfortable flow of life, because we didn't know what to expect, and we had no understanding of what adoption really meant, or even what the process ahead had for us and how hard it actually was. And I think about this and almost shamefully could say, if I really knew what was in store for us, I probably would have chickened out. Honestly.
Well, I think you could say that about biological kids just the same.
Yeah.
Sure, we don't know what our biological or our adoptive children are going to be like because they don't really have some of those genetic, predispositions and things like that. But you could say the same for your biological children. Ours are totally different. So, yeah, are we going to find some excuse to not obey, or are we going to obey? I think that's the bottom line, because it did not make sense on paper financially or sleep-wise. I mean, we weren't getting any.
Yeah, it all came down to, and we were still kids. I mean, honestly, we were kids raising babies, and we were still learning each other. I mean, this was just a few years into marriage for us. And so we were just kind of learning along the way. But after a year of wrestling, we came to the end of that year, because that was in January that I clearly heard God speak. And then it was December when we kind of had what you like to call our catalyst moment, where that was the year and the month of that year that we got the call about the baby. And then I've told our listeners this story, that we rushed to the hospital and we thought this was it, because we had just gotten to the point where we were so weary from the wrestling back and forth about should we, shouldn't we, that I literally had just prayed that morning, God, would you just put a baby in a basket and have somebody ring the doorbell and leave it on our front porch? I mean, like, that's where I was mentally. And so we got that phone call, and I just knew that was it. And then that ended up being one of the most traumatic days for you and I. And on the other side of that, we grieved, I think, rather unexpectedly. And it kind of surprised me with you, because you're such an easygoing person and you don't let things bother you typically. And sometimes I even get frustrated because I'm like, would you please just get upset with me for like 5 seconds? But this really hit you hard, and it really shocked me. And it took us months to even think about trying again.
Yes, and I guess you got to be careful what you pray for, because you prayed for that delivery, and we didn't specify what kind of delivery we'd get. So, yes, I remember turning around, working, driving close to the hospital, and then getting the call and immediately turning around and making that change, calling my boss, calling our family that lived local, that this was about 2 to 3 weeks premature for us. We had nothing pink for sure. And so I remember most from that day, I got there a few minutes before you did, because you were getting your mom, I believe. And I remember getting there, and I wrote a letter to this child that I hadn't even met yet. We had a name for her. We had all these, just like you do with a biological child, you make plans mentally, what they're going to be like, what we're going to do together, what their, tendencies might be. And we had known you had known the birth mother. Sorry, we had not met this birth mother, but we hadn't even met the attorney.
Right.
So everything was wild about this whole story. Sorry, I've got like 17 stories in my head.
Welcome to the last decade of our lives.
Right. So anyway, I remember going in, and I'm sure your listeners have already heard the whole story, but for me, I had a really hard time looking back now. I can see that God was trying to tell me this was not going to be your child. I remember looking at the child, and of course, anybody who has a calling, I feel, to take care of children or people in general, are going to look on a new child as, I will help that child. I'm not going to turn that child away, but I will tell you that I personally just looked at her and did not feel like she was ours.
Yeah.
I remember telling God, if she's ours, I'm going to love her, but I just didn't feel it. So the rest of the story goes.
Well, that's a really good point too, and I think that's something, because the point of our conversation today is really just to share the lessons that we've learned, and that doesn't all mean rosy lessons. I mean, that was a tough one for us, and I mean, we sat down with a couple not too long ago who were struggling with infertility, and they were like, well, adoption's the next logical step, but we just don't feel it. And I think that's an important point to say, and a lesson that we've learned is, it doesn't have to be like, God is very specific in what he wants your family to look like. And just because everybody around you might be adopting, or because you're not able to conceive a biological child, that's your only option for having a family, which it's a great option, but it also doesn't substitute the emptiness in your heart when you are longing to have that biological child. And so you had that feeling right off the bat. And honestly, it was such a whirlwind in that particular instance where we were looking at that child. And I think I too can look back now and honestly say that I felt the same way when I looked at her. Like there was just something there. Like when our child that God did bring into our family through adoption, when we met her, I mean, we knew there was just an understanding in our hearts. I think that was our child, but this child was not. And then it ended up totally being the Lord's protection that this child did not come home with us in 2013 because 2 other families had paid attorneys to complete this adoption for this child, and we had no knowledge of it. I mean, we were smack in the middle of trafficking and federal fraud, and we had no idea.
Welcome to adoption.
Welcome to adoption.
Welcome to adoption. It is a messy process full of legal paperwork, which is why the episode Everything You Need to Know from an Adoption Attorney is great. And not surprisingly, the next most popular episode. Summer's special guest is an attorney named Lucrece Bundy. Lucrece always had a passion for helping children, but didn't expect God would call her to help children and parents from a legal perspective. Now she is not only a lawyer advocating for families, but has a YouTube channel dedicated to advising parents wanting to answer the call. Here's a clip from her conversation with Summer.
I think as I was thinking about and preparing for our conversation today, and I know you spend your days answering questions for families, and that's what I do as well. And in my big girl job, as I call it, this is my fun job. But 2 questions that really come up every single time, and that's how much time and how much is this going to cost? Mm-hmm. So I figured that's probably a good place for especially those who are maybe knocking on the door of adoption and they're like, I need to know all the things. So let's discuss both as we get started today. And I think about that question of how long will this take? And that is such a loaded question that's really hard for us to answer. And so I want to give you freedom to answer this based on kind of your experience and what you're seeing in practice. But what I've seen, Lucrece, is there's been this massive shift in the availability of children for adoption, and it's just dramatically changed in recent years. And so as you're answering this question about time for our families, also feel free to speak into that shift and where you're seeing the greatest need for adoptive families right now.
Yeah, absolutely. What I tell families usually is it may feel like it's very natural to think, okay, God's calling me to adoption, it must be a baby. For of all the families that I talk to, they automatically think that that's what it is. It's a baby.
Yeah.
I challenge that because I think just like I had to let go of the idea of how I thought I was going to fulfill God's calling on my life, I think that families actually need to take a step back and actually ask the Lord, what do you mean when you say adopt? Let's start there. Do you want me to adopt a baby? Do you want me, instead of just as assuming that a baby is what God is saying, adoption doesn't equal baby.
That's good.
And a lot of the families that I work with, this is where we start. I tell them, I know that that's what you strongly believe, but I want to challenge that. And I want you to actually take the time to really pray and ask the Lord, do you want me to adopt from foster care? Do you want me to, is there an orphan somewhere in, I don't know, some other country you want me to, like how, when you say adoption, Lord, tell me what you mean by that. Yeah. I don't want just my will and my understanding to color all of this. And I honestly think that some families just end up, running to a lot of barriers because maybe they haven't taken the time to just ask the Lord what type of adoption. So here's a good example. One of my good friends, they felt called to adoption, but the Lord specifically told them, I want you to adopt special needs kids internationally. Yeah. And they had that was never a part of their plan. They got married, they were going to have their babies and enjoy their lives. Never once did they dream about adopting special needs children.
Right.
But the Lord was so specific with them because it took the time to listen. And so now they've adopted 3 special needs kids. I think one is from Africa, the other 2 are from India. Wow. And they're just through that process. And they've been so refined by the Lord through this journey that they're seeing how this was God's plan for them. But he used the adoption to refine them so much to make them look more like Jesus. Yeah. So I tell families, take a step back and really pause. Am I just thinking baby because that's what I hear everywhere? Or is that actually what the Lord is saying when he says adoption? So now once you answer that question, right? If the Lord says, I want you to adopt an older child from foster care, the timeline differs, right?
Yeah.
If the Lord is really telling you newborn, then the time is going to be different. If the Lord is saying international, the time for that differs as well. Yeah. And so depending on which path you choose, the timeline and also the amount of money that you're going to spend is going to change. And I think that very basic, like that foundation is what a lot of families miss when they jump the gun and just go to newborn adoption. It's easy then to lose a lot of money and a lot of time, because by
Yes.
the time you make that decision and then you realize, oh, maybe that wasn't the right decision, you have to take all these steps back and then
Right.
start over, right? You've just spent all this time and money.
Great
So I
point.
tell my families, just wait before the Lord and ask Him, God, we just give you, we lay down what we want. Show us what you want for us so that we can fulfill whatever your will is for our lives. So I
Yeah.
hope that answers the question. I mean, I think that when it comes to the timeline and the money, it really depends on in the choice that you make, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I've had families that have adopted a newborn within 12 months, but that's because they knew the steps to take. They had a roadmap to follow, and they knew what to do. They had the information that they needed. It's the power of having knowledge, And
Yes.
then I know families that it took them 3, 4 years. Why? Because they made so many mistakes along the way that it just kept delaying them and delaying them and delaying them.
Yeah.
So my thing is, after almost a decade of doing adoptions, there's no reason why it should take you more than 12 months to adopt. If you have a roadmap, you know what to do, you know red flags to watch out for, and you know what God's called you to do, because God is the one who's called you to it. He already knows how it's all going to work out.
Yeah.
It shouldn't take 4 years, unless you're doing international adoption. Obviously, they give you timelines, but
Yeah.
it just shouldn't take you that long.
Yeah.
That's from my experience. That's what I tell families,
Yes.
and usually it's because they've made some mistakes along the way.
Lots of good advice in that small clip. A reminder to be open to different kinds of adoption, an encouraging word that it shouldn't take more than 4 years. But of course, we all make mistakes, and it's so easy to make mistakes with such a confusing and stressful process. That's why we're here to hopefully help support, encourage, and answer these questions, give you more information and insight, and help you prepare for these things. But with all this stress and hardship, maybe you're even wondering if this is your calling. And that's why Summer did an episode called Listener Q&A, Am I Really Called to Adopt or Foster? And I'm sure you know that if God calls you to something, there's not much you can do about it. But it's okay to ask questions. Here's a clip from that episode.
One of the things that I have really loved in starting this podcast is hearing from you as listeners and receiving messages from you, both with kind words and then your questions. And I want to remind you that this podcast is here to serve you as a resource and a place of encouragement as you navigate your individual journey. And so I want to take some time to hear your questions and respond to them in the form of episodes. And so that's what we're going to do today. And I want to share about a recent conversation I had with a listener named Morgan. Now, I got her permission to share her name before recording this episode, and I always want to honor and respect your privacy as listeners. So please know that if you send me a message, I'm not going to just read that without speaking with you first. But I would love to take any questions, any issues, any concerns or struggles that you're having and turn it into the form of an episode that can serve others who are going through similar struggles. So today's episode is dedicated to those of you who, like Morgan, are struggling with the call of adoption, or foster care can apply to this as well. And I'm going to read her question for you just so that you can hear in her words. Maybe this is something that you would like to express and haven't been able to, haven't had that outlet to do so. Here's what she said. Hey, Summer, I have been struggling with the call of adoption, and I just came across your podcast. I think it's another God thing that He led me to your page. Our stories are so similar. My husband and I have 2 biological kids. Thought we were done having kids, but this past month, adoption has been laid on my heart. And I have this anxious feeling 24/7, and it's all I can think about. My husband has never really questioned it, but really is struggling with it as well. She said, long story short, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it because I feel 100% that this is from God. The financial part of it is hard to wrap my head around, and I obviously want my husband and I on the same page. Okay, so common. Maybe some of you are listening right now and you're nodding your heads and you're like, this is exactly how I feel, or I know how Morgan feels because that is where I was as well in my journey. So true for my husband and I as well. It is such a difficult thing to navigate when you're trying to figure out what this calling is, what it's about, and what it's going to look like for you in the practical and day-to-day life. And I serve each day in speaking with families. I have this task of a difficult balance, honestly, of being honest enough to prepare you without scaring you away from the calling altogether. And that might sound really dramatic, but it really is true. If I were to just like verbal vomit on you all right now, you probably would never come back to this podcast again. So hopefully I'm able to balance it well enough where I'm able to give you enough information to sift through and see how it applies to you and what the Lord is saying to you. Ultimately, I want the Lord's voice to be king over anyone else's voice in your life. And as you navigate this calling, there's going to be a lot of voices that are going to be speaking to you. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit in today's episode. You're going to have a lot of well-intended people who love you and care about your well-being, who may call this calling into question for you. But if you know that the Lord is speaking, that's whose voice I want you to lean into the most. So let's break down Morgan's question just a little bit and address several things as we go along today. Number one, struggling with the call. First of all, I shared this with Morgan. She and I actually ended up getting to have a phone conversation after I received this message from her. And I'm so excited at what God is doing in her journey as a result of that. But I want you to know that you are not alone in your questions. You're not alone in your fears and your struggle and wrestling to say yes to adoption or foster care. I want you to hear me. This is a vulnerable calling, and it is one that will change your life forever. But the encouragement on the other side of that is that there is so much growth in the discomfort, even in struggling with the call itself. God is drawing you into uncomfortable places where He is seeking to grow you. Because I can tell you, whatever this journey looks like for you, it will not be what you imagine or expect. It can't be. It's so unique and it's beautiful. And dealing with the brokenness, I mean, that goes back to the fear factor of, I don't want to scare you that there's something horrible on the other side of this, but it is going to change you. There's risk involved to your heart, to your finances, and certainly to your comfort. And it's so easy to get in your head and wonder if this truly is from the Lord, if this truly is what God is saying to you. And it's really easy to lean into all the reasons why, quote unquote, this isn't a good idea. So we're going through the book of Exodus right now in a sermon series at my church. And as we have studied it Sunday in and Sunday out, I cannot ignore the correlations between God's calling over Moses' life and our calling as foster and adoptive parents. I think about specifically when you talk about the struggle of the calling and saying yes to the Lord. If you go and you look at Exodus chapter 3 and 4, I mean, it really is, the breakdown is just like this unbelievable argument between Moses and the Lord. And what's amazing is how the Lord was willing to listen and respond to Moses. And even though there was this arguing back and forth and God's like, this is what I want you to do. And Moses is like, I don't want to, ultimately, that God had a steadfast stance and He had a response from Moses. And so I hope that kind of humanizes him a little bit, because we see him as this hero of the faith, right? And we talk about him kind of being this faith hall of fame and this amazing thing that Moses got to do. But when we back it up to this initial call, and when God reached out to him through the burning bush and then carried him through this conversation before he stepped out in obedience, Moses is sitting there in chapters 3 and 4 of Exodus. He's going, they won't believe me. They're not going to listen to me. Who am I? I'm slow of speech. And then ultimately, after God responds with, I'll tell you what to say. I'll send some help. I'll do this for you. Don't worry, I'm with you. Moses goes, I don't want to. And the Lord's like, you're going, essentially. And so it kind of ties into these excuses that we give the Lord, honestly, when He starts speaking to our heart. Lord, this might not work out. I can't love a child and then just give them back. This is talking about foster care, by the way. People will try and talk me out of it or judge my decision, or Lord, I don't have the money for that, or this just sounds too hard, too messy, too uncomfortable. And the Lord is steadfast in His response and His stance with you as well. If He's calling you, He's promising you the same things that He promised Moses, and that is ultimately His presence and His guidance for the journey ahead. He promises that for us, just as He promised that to Moses. Not answers, not ease, but presence. And that is key. So I hope that encourages you as you're wrestling through and kind of struggling with this initial call.
It's okay to wrestle with God. It's okay to ask him questions and wonder what is going on. The Bible is full of people in that same situation. And luckily, God can put someone in your life who helps you find the answers and get that clarification, which is what Summer wants to be for you. So if you have questions for Summer, she wants to hear them. In fact, she wants to do a series next year called The Lies Foster and Adoptive Families Believe. But as she's crafting this series, she needs your help. She needs to know what lies the enemy is whispering in your ear about this calling. You can email her at summercolbert@gmail.com or message her on Instagram. Both links are in the episode show notes below. We are excited to hear from you and want to help defeat those lies and make sure you know that you are not alone. Now for the episode we will wrap up with. It is the 5th most popular episode thus far on Called to Love. It's called Understanding God's Heart for Adoption and Foster Care with Tim Wolkiewicz. Tim was our special guest on this episode. He is a very talented animator who has worked on VeggieTales, Hasbro's Transformers Rescue Bots, Warner Brothers' Green Eggs and Ham, and Disney's Monsters at Work. He is also passionate about adoption and foster care. Tim and his wife have both fostered and adopted children, 2 of which internationally. With this passion, he created a children's activity book specifically for adopted and foster kids called The Flock. In his conversation with Summer, they talked about his family's story and how they came into this calling, how important it is for husband and wife to be on board, and how this calling doesn't just impact the child you're adopting or fostering, but it has an impact on the bio family and even social workers and so many more people in this process. Here's a small clip from that episode.
Absolutely. Yeah. And knowing that his plan, whatever that is going to come to fruition, but it's not without its challenges. And I appreciate you speaking to that because I think it can be easy to fall into this idea that adoption is pretty or foster care is this amazing rescue mission that we can go on as Christians, but it is very much life in the trenches. And we realize that. And sometimes it throws people really, really off kilter in a way that they think, I can't do this anymore. So, we know that adoption is hard. We know that it's expensive. We know that life with a child who's experienced trauma or loss in any way is hard. And so what for your family, Tim, has kept y'all going and continuing to say yes over the span of almost 20 years?
Yes. There's a saying that says, if you want to hear God laugh, you tell him your plans. And then, he does what he wants to do. For us, it's, again, number one is praying through it because it does get really hard. And my wife and I always talk about being a married couple, how hard it is for a single person to do this. And there are several, and God bless them. They're fantastic people. But it is real. It does get hard. And a lot of times we're like, we're done. We can't do this anymore. And, I could share several stories of, how we took in our first foster child, and he was a 3.5-year-old, 30-pound linebacker. He just destroyed our house with holes in the wall. We still have marks in there. Like, oh yeah, that's where he did that. And I smile now because it's funny now. At the time, I was like, what did we just do?
Right.
But even to this day, one daughter has pictures of all the children we had in our home. And that's part of the motivation there. It's like, look who we invited into our home. And I wonder where they are today. And you get to pray for them.
That's amazing.
And like, oh, who's the next one going to be? And then you see the numbers of the kids in foster care too. And you're like, well, if we don't do it, who's going to do it? As much as we encourage other people. So I don't want that to come across as guilt driven. But it's more like, we're here. I think Vodi Bachman is great for saying this. He's a great person to listen to because he adopted several kids, and I'm going to mess up his quote. So please forgive me, Vodi, if you're listening. But he asked a question. He's like, yeah, you guys got 9 children. How come you don't, why only 9? He's like, because we couldn't get 10. And then he goes on to say, like, what else are we here for? Right. I've come to the belief that, once you're saved, once God adopts you into his family, he could take you home right? But he left us here for a reason. So I think part of that reason is figuring out what that reason is, and then answering that call, and moving forward in faith, right? And knowing that God is going to be with you through it. And also, like I said, we've been doing this for a while, so we have the hindsight to see how God has grown us through this process too. Had we not done it, the blessings that we would been able to have today, not monetarily, but the growth closer to the image of Christ, we wouldn't have it any other way had we said no, right? So I mean, I can go on and on about that, but that's the biggest motivation is seeing what God has already done and anticipating what he's going to do as we continue.
That's amazing. I love that. And what a beautiful example of your daughter creating that visual in your home for the calling that God has placed, and how that's affected all of you. And I know that's a huge concern, and we've experienced that concern as well. We kind of unofficially fostered for a time as well. And there's always that concern of the safety of the children who we know God has permanently entrusted to our care, and how that might affect them. So do you want to speak to that at all, Tim?
Yeah, that's great. I wanted to bring that point up. That's fantastic, because one of the big concerns for me as a father, we already had 2 kids. We had the perfect home, right? The perfect little children, and I was concerned.
Right.
Like, you hear about the conditions some of these kids come through, which is not their fault, and the horror stories that some other people have had, and there's a lot.
Yeah.
And I was like, how's that going to affect our children, right? And then God spoke to me, not audibly, but he's like, he flipped the script. It's like, but what about the positive effect you're going to have on the kids that are coming in, who don't know Christ, who don't know what a family looks like? And then that's when you zip your mouth and you just do it, right? God's telling you this is what you're going to do, and you do it. And it's true, though. I mean, we've had several kids come through our home, and their families and social workers, and you see just the demeanor of them when they leave. It's different, and you've made an impact, even if it's a small impact. You're just dropping seeds and hoping someone else will water them, and a lot of times you don't hear back from the kids who get reunified or their parents, even if you've had a good relationship during it. But the confidence that we have in God, knowing that he put them in our home for a time, and then seeing the effects of your family afterwards. Like, my kids have gotten to see what it means to live out the gospel and care for others sacrificially, because it takes a lot, and it takes time away from your family. And we've had conversations with my kids about that too, where they're like, can we just have family time, without a foster kid? And there's times for that, because they get the children get reunified with their parents, or they move on. And this is some advice I give to people who have been fostering for a while too, or just starting the process, is that once the child does get reunified, it's important to take a pause and reflect on it, because you want to have the connection with your family, but it's also a traumatic experience for you, because you're pouring all this stuff into a child. You're loving them like your own, and then they go away. And I tell people it's kind of like you're leasing your kids anyway, because you don't know when you're going to go or when God's going to call them home. Your job is to care for them as best you can, keep them safe, and guide them. And hopefully you've done a great job, and they go off and they can be independent and go.
Those are the 5 most popular episodes of Called to Love. This has been such a fun journey working on this podcast with Summer and seeing how God is growing it. And we are just so grateful for you listening. We hope and pray that this podcast is an encouraging and useful resource as you navigate all of the things that have to do with adoption and foster care. And remember, you are not alone. And Summer would love to connect with you. Links to her email and social media are down below. Send her that lie that's been bothering you, and we will have new episodes in the new year.
I pray you have been encouraged by today's episode to walk in faith and continue to embrace your own call to love. Until next time, blessings, sweet friends.